Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Geopolitics Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nico Safo, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. We're here today to talk about supply chains, and it really doesn't get more timely than this. Yesterday, the White House issued an executive order mandating a review of America's supply chains, and one of the sectors identified in that executive order is something we'll be talking about today, which is batteries used in electric vehicles. So this is very timely work, and we're so excited to be able to have this conversation. I am joined with two colleagues, one, Sarah Ladislaw, Senior Vice President, Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program, and Ethan Zindler, who's the head of Americas at BloombergNEF, and also a non-resident senior associate with our program. This is the first of two reports we're going to be doing on this issue of clean energy supply chains, industrial policy, trade frictions, the question of China. A lot of things are coming together. And we also want to thank the Climate Imperative Foundation for their support in this ongoing work. Before I frame the discussion and get going, I do want to remind you that you can submit your questions. If you go on the website where you register for the event, there is a button there that allows you to submit a question, fill out the form, and my colleagues are going to pass those questions on to me. So we're here primarily because clean energy has taken off. And in particular, three technologies, wind, solar photovoltaics, and batteries used in electric vehicles have gone from niche technologies, 10, 15 years ago, to the mainstream. They're increasingly cost competitive. We're seeing more and more places around the world where solar and wind are the capacity of choice, and where electric vehicles are getting very close to cost parity with internal combustion engines. We are also have experienced over this period of time an enormous amount of trade frictions. Because these technologies have become competitive in large part because of government support and industrial action, subsidies, feed-in tariffs, local content rules. And so the story of clean energy supply chains and their evolution is intimately connected to trade friction and trade barriers and trade disputes. And there's also the reality of China, that over time, China has built a commanding position in two of those three industries, solar and batteries, and has a pretty substantial role also to play in wind. So there's a lot of things that are coming together. Our reliance on these new technologies, industrial action, and the trade frictions that have emerged from that industrial action, and also, of course, the reliance on China for these technologies at a time when the US relation with China is very contested. The European relation with China has friction as well. And so a lot of things are coming together. And so what we wanted to do in this sort of first report is lay out the scene for us and talk about what is happening, what has happened over the last sort of 15 years. And then in our second report, we'll try to get a little bit more into some of the questions about what do you do about that. So let me kick off our conversation. I'm going to turn to you, Sarah, and I wanted you to give us the intellectual and strategic context for this project. Why are we doing this work? What do you see out there in the public discourse, and how Washington and other governments are thinking about this topic that you feel is underappreciated, and that we think with our work, we will really fill a gap in that discourse? So Sarah, on to you.
Thanks very much, Nikos. And, before I get started, I just want to say a big thanks to BloombergNEF, who's been a really excellent partner in this endeavor. It's a lot of material for anybody who goes to the website and sees all of the sort of appendices and data that's put out there. It's been a lot to sort of comb through to get to the report that we were able to do. So just want to say big thanks to them. And then also, Nikos, your leadership on this project has been really, really amazing. As of our other colleagues, I always just want to give a shout out to the other people that worked on the project, but Logan Goldie Scott, Lachlan Carey, Paul Lascano, Jane Nakano, and Jenny Chase, everybody pulled together. This is the first of a couple of these that we're going to do, so there's been a lot of work going into it. So just want to say a big thanks to everybody that was involved. So, you're right, Nikos. I think, one of the things that brought this project to the fore for us is probably very similar to the folks at the White House thinking about a supply chain review, is that a lot of very large strategic paradigms have shifted, right? And so when you think about the way in which folks in the climate community circa the 1990s envisioned a pathway to a low carbon future, it was fundamentally about doing so in the context of a free and open global trading regime, whereby countries work together to find ways to drop the cost of clean energy technologies, trade them globally, and thereby sort of transform the global energy system. And we've moved on from that world in many ways. There is a big focus now in lots of different realms of economic policy making to really call into question the benefits of a global free trade system. It's not to say everybody sort of eschewed that view and has dismissed it, but there is a recalculation going on between what we need out of a global trade regime and what we need in our domestic economies. And we are increasingly seeing, not just in developing countries, which used to be the case, which the report sort of talks about in depth, and I think we'll talk about a little bit later, not just in developing countries, but in developed countries as well, this real premium on being able to justify more aggressive climate policy by bringing home more of the domestic economic benefits. And that has real implications, both for thinking about how we do climate policy on a very granular level, but how we interact with folks in the clean energy supply chain, other countries that similarly want to advantage manufacturing or create good green jobs. And the hope is that by bringing home more of those economic benefits, you're able to buy more political will, more economic justification for more aggressive climate policies. And so I think that's one sort of major shift that's taken place. The second major shift is on China, and we do spend a good portion of time, focusing on the role of China in these clean energy supply chains, the experience that China has been through to get to that place, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But our perspective in the climate world of China's role was, if they're able to drop the cost of clean energy technologies, that's great. That is actually quite helpful. We're very accommodative of China's rise in that way. Only when it sort of dawned on us that there was also negative competitive effects from very cheap solar PV is sort of the main example that people tend to think of in this area, that there were competitive disadvantages for our own sort of domestic manufacturing. Did we start to sort of change our perspective on this? And I would say, over the last 4 years in particular, as the United States and other countries have started to recognize not just competition with China in new ways and sort of decide to confront China in those competitive realms in different ways, but also the need to look at supply chains on a strategic level and figure out where there is too much reliance on one country, or there are vulnerabilities, those types of things. China falls into that basket of concern that we're in sort of a new realm with them. And then finally, the last thing I would say is we recognize that, as you said, Nikos, clean energy is in a new spot, right? It's not a niche market. This is not something that kind of like happens over on the side, that some new startup company called Bloomberg New Energy Finance tracks on the side. It's a major global enterprise. And we in this report are just looking at the more established technologies. Like, think about, what this is going to mean when entire countries have to change out their industrial base if we're going to meet these, 2050, net zero targets. this is going to be hands down the most competitive economic sector in the world. And so to think that we won't have sort of conflicts or trade conflicts or security conflicts that arise from that, I think is, not learning lessons of history. And so what we wanted to do with this work and the work that will come subsequently is to start to map out what that competition looks like, to start to map out what some of the security or trade vulnerabilities in clean energy supply chains will be. And this first report does what, I think any good analysis, needs to start with, which is like sort of learning where we've come from, right? Learning how these supply chains have grown over time, and then learning about, what we know about how countries have sort of engaged or grappled with their own industrial strategies in light of that.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think, that's a great cue for turning to Ethan, because at the end of the day, we are trying to sort of tell that story and that chronicle. So let me turn to you, Ethan, for a little bit of that. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated doing this work with you all was, we lumped them together because it's convenient as clean energy supply chains. But we talk about very different markets. We talk about very different technologies. We talk about very different supply chains. So I wanted to ask you not just to tell the story overall, but also to highlight for us and for the audience some of the differences in thinking about wind versus battery versus solar, and what are the real commonalities in how these supply chains have developed and where they are, but also some of the important differences. So we shouldn't just lump them all together because they're all falling under the banner of quote unquote clean energy. So Ethan, on to you.
Yeah, so first, thanks. And Sarah, thanks for your comments. I think that's a great setup. And of course, thanks to you guys it's been a lot of fun to work on this project. The timing's been really interesting, of course. As you know, we've been at this for several months now. And so really interesting that it's today and this week that we put this report out. And frankly, we're happy to send this, particularly what we've said about batteries, happy to send it straight to the administration if they'd like to have a read, because we really have tried to think pretty carefully about these issues. Also, just thanks to my colleagues, Paul and Logan, for really all the hard work that they did in putting this all together for us. As you noted, yeah, this is not alternative energy. This is not. This is mainstream energy now, and $500 billion is how much we tracked last year, going into what we call the energy transition, and that a variety of different technologies. This is very much the middle of things. The vast majority of what got built in terms of new power generating capacity in the United States last year was wind and solar, not other technologies. So this is really where we're now going. And so from a strategic point of view, you're absolutely right, Sarah, that this is incredibly important. Nikos, to your question though, and to your point about about this, yes, we put it all under a giant umbrella that we call clean energy or energy transition or whatever you want to call it. But these are very different sectors, and they're at different stages of development. And I'd say the first thing to note is just in terms of their maturity, in terms of the level of cost, the level of actual deployment, and also cost competitiveness. So first and most importantly, we are at the point where wind and solar projects are typically very cost competitive, if not the lowest cost provider of power in many parts of the world, resource dependent, alternatives dependent, et cetera. But in a large number of countries, that's the case. In a large parts of the United States, that's also the case. So they have really arrived in many ways. Electric vehicles, I would put in the category as of almost there. We are probably just a few years, maybe 3 years out from some form of direct cost parity for electric vehicles on a so-called sticker basis. That is, you'll walk into a showroom, you'll look at an EV, you'll look at an internal combustion engine car, and the EV will simply be cheaper. You won't have to run some kind of total cost of ownership lifetime assessment. Think about gasoline prices. No, you'll just buy it because it's cheaper, and you'll buy it because it's better, and you'll do so without subsidies, because right now it is subsidies. It's really teeing off a lot of the market. We're not quite there yet, but we will get there in the next couple of years. The other thing that really differentiates these sectors is that the value chains are really very different in terms of the level of complexity of each of them, and also literally the equipment that's produced, the size and the shape and the weight and the ease with which some of it can be transported across international borders, and some of it cannot. I've got a couple slides I'm going to breeze through real quick, and if you could pull up the first one, I'm going to talk first just for a second about the photovoltaic sector, which of the three that we looked at, again, solar, wind, and propulsion batteries, this is the sector that I would say is most clearly dominated at the moment by Chinese players. There's a lot going on in the solar industry, and the rate of growth has just been spectacular in particularly the last 5 years. But one thing to note about PV modules, a typical panel that you might see on a roof someplace, is they have largely become commoditized. That is, there isn't an enormous amount of technological difference between one manufacturer's product and another's. And what that has meant is a really ferocious battle among manufacturers to keep a lid on costs. That has also meant a great deal of bankruptcies and thinning of the herd repeatedly within the solar manufacturing sector. And to be clear, there have been a lot of Western companies that have lost out, but there's also been plenty of Chinese companies that have lost out as well. But what I'm showing you guys here is just a very simple chart that I would note is in one of the deep dive reports that you can download specific to solar. And one of the basic points that we just want to make here is that even when you get a so-called US-made PV module, one that gets assembled in a plant somewhere in the United States, about 60% of the value of that module is still essentially accruing to China, as you'll see in that left-hand chart. If you buy one that is officially imported from Southeast Asia, even that also, most of the value accrues to China, because those plants in turn are buying upstream equipment from plants back in China. So to a large degree, the PV industry and the lowest cost manufacturing, the highest volume manufacturing, the most automated manufacturing is happening in China and or Southeast Asia. And even in Southeast Asia, many of those plants are owned by Chinese firms. That is essentially where we're at today. The wind sector, and if you would, the next slide, please. The wind sector is a good deal more heterogeneous, and there are manufacturing hubs in many countries around the world, and manufacturing hubs that produce the different parts of the turbine, whether it's the nacelle, the gearbox, or the support tower, or the blades, which are really the main components that you'll find. There are essentially large national incumbents in the United States. It would be General Electric in Europe, it's Vestas and Siemens Gamesa, and they have enjoyed, for some time, strong positions in the market. The other thing to note about, I would argue about wind is that the equipment, I would argue, has not become commoditized. That is, these are highly specialized pieces of equipment. And so as a result, while there is certainly a fight on cost always, performance really, really matters, and particularly as they've been making these turbines larger and larger. So anyway, the one chart I'm showing here again is from the deep dive that we published, and that I welcome folks to download, and it just demonstrates that for a typical U.S. installed wind turbine, you're seeing that about 60% of the value accrues to the U.S. That is, manufacturing dollars that come into and go to U.S. based companies. I wouldn't say we're at a sort of steady state as far as wind is concerned, and there's going to be a lot more growth, particularly in the offshore wind sector. But this is now a pretty large and pretty well-established industry with a bunch of different hubs in different places. It's also costly to ramp up manufacturing. And then finally, and maybe most interestingly, I do want to talk about batteries for electric vehicles, and that's the last slide, if you don't mind. This, to some degree, I would argue, is the one where there is arguably the most to play for. Electric vehicles were really only about 2 or 3% of U.S. Vehicle sales last year. We sold about 325,000 of them in the United States versus about 15 million total internal combustion engine cars that were sold. But the growth is is definitely underway, and you can see it certainly in the announcements from large automakers and the pledges that they've made to phase out their ICE vehicles and to turn to EVs. We at BNEF have been saying for a while now that we think that the majority of sales by 2040 will be electric vehicles. It could frankly happen faster. It really depends on a bunch of different factors, but this market is growing very, very quickly. There are now 10 million EVs on the road worldwide. It's really grown from almost virtually nothing 10 years ago to that number. So there's a lot to play for. The difference, I would say, and there are a bunch of differences in terms of the battery value chain, without going into too much detail, but just to say is that what we have seen, I would say so far, is that typically as a demand market for EVs starts to emerge, in the short run, the industry will import batteries and battery components into that market or the completed vehicles to serve the market. But once a market starts to reach some kind of critical mass, there is a grouping and a clustering that goes on around manufacturing for this equipment. And we've definitely seen that in China, which is, by the way, not just the largest supplier of these batteries, but by far the largest demand market for these batteries. But now we're also starting to see it in Europe as well, as some of the requirements around efficiency of vehicles there have been rising and EV sales there have been rising. And so we're seeing more battery plants being developed there. Just to touch on this slide, and then I'll stop, is just to say that we at BloombergNEF do an annual survey around battery pricing every year, and we ask suppliers and buyers what they're buying at. You can see two prices here in these two pinwheels that are actually the same, and that's because we actually anonymize the pricing. We don't give it out for specific manufacturers. But I guess the point I'm just trying to make here is that we took a look at two sort of typical, or not typical, but two manufacturing plants in the US to try to figure out how much of the value accrues locally. And again, the story is complicated like it is in the other sectors. You look at the Tesla plant and about 45% accrues to the US, and about 45% accrues to Japan. And of course, that's due to the partnership of a Tesla-Panasonic partnership. If you look at a plant that's owned by a Korean manufacturer like an LG, again, you still get about a third of the accrued value in the US if it's a US-based plant, but you're getting the majority of it from overseas inevitably. So there's no simple answer. It's a world of integrated supply chains. You just because you build a plant in one country doesn't mean that all the value ends up in that country. There is a lot of complications associated with this. But nonetheless, I do think this is a good starting point, as you, Sarah, you and Nikos have mentioned, in terms of thinking about kind of where we are at the moment. Where we go next is really the really interesting question, which I know that we'll come on to in the next study, but it is worth noting it's a very heterogeneous marketplace out there at the moment.
Thank you, Ethan. And I do want to put an additional plug. I mean, Ethan extracted one graphic out of a ton of information on the website. And I know I learned a lot sort of during these past few months as we worked through that material. So I urge you to go and get on a deeper dive on our website. Sarah, let me turn back to you, because I think there's sort of two things that came from Ethan's slides and intervention that I wanted to get your thoughts on. One, you just see that those big sort of China chunks, right, in most of the donuts, a big chunk of the value accruing to China. So I definitely wanted to, you alluded to China in your opening remarks, but maybe dig a little bit deeper. How much of this is really about those, big red chunks of value that China has dominated? So that's one. But the second one is, you also saw that there's no sort of uniform color. These are global supply chains, and our trading system hasn't digested, hasn't processed these global supply chains very well. We've had a lot of friction. We've had a lot of trade disputes, even from the start of when governments started to support these industries. We've had governments going to the WTO, launching complaints against each other. So I wanted you to elaborate on those sort of two elements of this work and how you're thinking about China on the one hand, and how much of this is about our anxiety towards China And secondly, the world trading system and its ability to really facilitate or obstruct the development of clean energy technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Nikos. And I think it's, obviously, there's a lot that comes out in our political or policy rhetoric about the dominance of China in clean energy supply chains and a whole bunch of different technologies, right? So clearly, the U.S. has sort of woken up to the fact that there's a lot of quite frankly, Chinese industrial strategy that has put them in a position of being very competitive. And so, I think we mentioned in the report that as the evolution of these technologies and these supply chains was going on, at one point we kind of just said, well, China will never really be able to compete at our level, right? And that's just not true, right? So a big part of this China narrative is the self-consciousness of other countries going, oh, wait a minute, we were trying to play in those spheres too. Some of the behavior, maybe the technology transfer policies, some of those things, probably not great things, right? Definitely things that we were fighting through trade disputes and other measures to say, hey, listen, this isn't fair. But just on their ability to, do very aggressive subsidies, both on the supply side and on the demand side, to be able to cultivate this market. I actually think we're taking a look at China in a new light right now and saying, what have they done that we probably should try to do, and what have they done that we probably shouldn't try to do? A previous report put out by our colleague Scott Kennedy on their EV manufacturing ventures shows how deeply inefficient some of their policies was. I mean, if you tried to say, hey, the United States should spend as much as China has spent to grow their clean energy industry, we're not likely to do that. We don't have that sort of same political system. So I think a lot of this is really about us taking a look at, China's position and how it's prioritized clean energy technologies and used industrial strategy to try and go after it, and quite frankly succeeded. And I think that that's probably a healthy thing for us to be doing. We can talk a little bit more about what that might mean for policymakers, but I think that that's really, at the core of a lot of this. From a strategic standpoint, it would be you absolutely have to spend some time asking the question about what's the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship, right? It is the most important tension in global economic and political and security dynamics, right? And we don't know if it's going to go well or not well, right? I mean, the immediate response, to the supply chain executive order from yesterday from China was to remind us, that we're supposed to be dedicated to global supply chains and we don't want to sort of mess that up. There's so much strategic time and attention going to, how did the US and China maintain their position as strategic competitors and not have a race to the bottom, right? How do we make sure that this doesn't go in the direction where just everybody's paying more and everybody's security concerned and we have to think about decoupling, versus like, how do we accommodate space for each other given our different sort of, domestic political needs and our commitment to, trying to make sure that, internationally we still get, the benefits of some of these public goods. So I think a huge part of that is also sort of really just not knowing what direction the U.S. China relationship is going to go. We have to, recognize that under the last administration, there were real strategic reviews going on, and in the past in trade disputes we've had, national security concerns over where China is invested into the U.S. Electric power system. That might come back again, right? That could be a very legitimate area of concern. As we can probably talk about a little bit later, we've got human rights concerns in the solar PV supply chain that have arisen that could be very disruptive. And so I think as much as, so what we realize that those types of threats and concerns exist, we haven't done is take those clean energy supply chains as seriously as, from an energy security standpoint, as we've taken, things like oil supply security, right? I mean, we've spent a huge amount of time making sure that there's diversity and thinking about the vulnerability in that system. We've not spent nearly that amount of time in the clean energy space. And I know a lot of people like to think of, clean energy as being fundamentally different, right? Sort of devoid of these geopolitical concerns. It is absolutely not going to be the case. I don't believe that for a minute. So I think that, looking at these supply chains and saying, do we have short-term acute vulnerabilities? Do we have long-term strategic vulnerabilities? what does that mean? How should we prepare for those? Should we have diversity in these supply chains? What is the appropriate US role in that? What's the appropriate role for Europe? Like we just haven't really treated clean energy in that space. And so, the dominance of China in that supply chain, yes, it's about China. Yes, it's about all of those geopolitical concerns. Yes, it's about the tariff disputes in the past. But fundamentally, it's also about starting to treat clean energy supply chains as, strategically important and thinking about where we've got vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me just say for the audience, you can take the last 2 minutes that Sarah did there as the trailer for the second report that we're going to put out, right? Because it's really about trying to think through those questions. And in particular, as Sarah said, we've had decades of experience dealing with oil supply shocks and strategic petroleum reserves and the IEA creation and all these structures that we've created. And so I think we have to spend some time thinking about what does that security world look like. It's not going to be the same, but we've learned a lot over decades doing this work. What can we apply from that experience to this new energy world that we are living in? So, Ethan, let me turn to you. On the first question, I asked you to summarize the 3 papers. You have another 3 papers on our website. And what we wanted to do is do some sort of case study deep dives. So we looked at China, we looked at India, and we looked at Germany. And so I wanted to ask you to give us sort of some of the main highlights of what we found in these deeper dives about how these countries navigated the development of markets, the development of manufacturing, how they used or didn't use trade policy, and sort of walk us through in just like a few minutes some of the main things that we should take out when we read these three case study reports.
So thanks, Nikos, and I would say I wish I could say that we looked at these 3 countries. They delivered very clear answers on exactly what the U.S. should do, and now here you go. The conclusions are not surprisingly that it was complicated, and that in each case there were some interesting strategic objectives achieved and plenty that were not. And so it's something to certainly just keep in mind in terms of managing expectations. As you know, the world moves fast in clean energy, things change, technologies develop, costs decline. There is only, we here in the Washington world like to think that the world can revolve entirely around policy making, and policy can influence events, but nonetheless there are a lot of other things that at play in these industries overall. So I'll talk through a couple of them though, and yes, I as you note on the website, please do download these because I'm not going to do these stories really justice. But there are essentially three little snapshots that we put together, looking at India, Germany, and China, and specific aspects of what each country tried to achieve. I'm not going to go too deep into each of these because I definitely want to give us more time to talk about other stuff and also to take questions. But in a couple minutes, I'll just say that in India, we looked at the National Solar Mission, which was a plan launched back in 2009 with a goal of getting 20 gigawatts of solar capacity online by 2022. Basically what they did in India was they sought to mandate that if you wanted to win a contract to deliver power to one of the state-run utilities, you essentially had to have a certain percentage of your equipment be made domestically, 30% specifically. Without going into a great number of details, there were loopholes in the rule, which frankly, thin film solar company First Solar, with the backing of U.S. funding, was able to exploit. Then India sought to clamp down on the rules. Then the U.S. complained to the World Trade Organization. And then 3 years later, the World Trade Organization essentially ruled in the U.S.'s favor. But it's worth noting that 3 years is an eternity in the age of clean energy, and maybe even more specifically in the era of solar, where things move super fast. In terms of, did it work? India today has well over 40 gigawatts of online capacity. They'd aimed for 20 by 2022, so they can check that box. Originally, they certainly have higher targets now. There is some manufacturing downstream of solar in India, but the country is still importing from China, which is the country that you arguably they would least want to import equipment from. So it's been a mixed bag. It's certainly spurred the growth of a demand market, but it has not necessarily spurred quite as big a supply as they would have liked. I'll talk for just a second about Germany. So Germany, as you'll see in the report, we look back at their renewable energy law from 2004. And I think we made the point that we think this is the most important piece of legislation, or arguably ever, in terms of sparking the market for solar. Basically, the Germans sought, primarily for environmental reasons, to scale up a solar market by offering very generous feed-in tariffs, as they're called, to subsidize the demand for solar. They also offered cut rate financing through development banks to make it cheaper for people to actually do solar. And at one point, way back when, in 2004 and 5, Germany was 2/3 of the world's demand for solar, and was supplying about 1/4 of the world's photovoltaic cells. But I would argue, much more importantly, Germany was the one that sounded the signal to the rest of the world that this market could scale up, and could scale up fast. It was the indicator that got, frankly, I would argue, got China's attention, that there was a real export market there for solar, and it triggered a wave of PV manufacturing investment and scale up, which really reduced prices for the rest of the world, and that was good for us and the rest of the world. It was not great news for the manufacturers in Germany. And these days, Germany, other than very far upstream with one particular firm, is not a major supplier of PV equipment. However, Germany in the process did develop a lot of expertise on installing solar. And that's something that they've been able to use domestically, but also abroad, in terms of building projects in other countries around the world. But it's not been a clean-cut win for the manufacturing side by any means in Germany. And then I realize I've only given myself a short amount of time to talk about China, but we can come back on this. But one of the things that what we did portray in the report, both in the main report and in the snapshot, is looking at China's commitment around electric vehicles and its strategic decision in about 2012 to declare that it was going to really push to have a lot more EVs on the road. The goal was really twofold. It was to clean up the existing vehicle fleet in China, but also ultimately to become a major export player. They did this by offering rebates. In some cities in China, you simply couldn't get a license plate for a car unless it was an electric vehicle. There's also been a tremendous amount of financing and funding made available to battery makers and others in the EV supply chain. Just to finish, I would say that, today, China, as I mentioned earlier, is by far the largest national market for electric vehicles, with about half of the 10 million vehicles that are on the road today in China. There were 1.3 million of them sold in 2020 alone. It's funny, for all the Super Bowl ad with GM and focusing on Norway and the percentage of sales. Yes, Norway has had a very high percentage of EV sales, but on a unit basis, no one comes close to China, at least so far. So they have been very successful in building a demand market. Almost all of this, certainly Tesla is starting to sell vehicles over there, but the vast majority of the EVs being sold over there are from companies like BYD, BAIC, SAIC, Geely, a bunch of other companies that, frankly, most Americans have probably never heard of. So the fact that we've not heard of them means that the Chinese have not yet succeeded necessarily in creating an export market for their EVs, but they have been very successful in building a supply chain and demand for EVs domestically. So different lessons from different markets. And we can come back on this question on supply and demand, because I think that's kind of an important one to take away from this. But it's been a very mixed story. And there's clearly, to use the cliche, no silver bullet when it comes to these types of policies.
Thank you, Ethan. Let me, I want to do another round to both of you. and then go to some of the questions in the audience. We already have a lot of questions, and I'm seeing some really good ones. So if you have a question, now is a great time to get it in. Sarah, let me turn to you and just get you to react a little bit to some of the things that Ethan said. Obviously, you can sort of see from the executive order, but you can also see the overall tone of the administration. We're really going to be talking about deployment and manufacturing as sort of two different spheres, and sometimes they can go together. Sometimes they can be in tension if you do local content and the local content raises costs and all that. What did you take away from these sort of 3 case studies? I mean, obviously, we're studying what others are doing in the hope of maybe trying to copy good things that they did and avoid mistakes they made. What was your takeaway from these 3 case studies?
Yeah, thanks. I think, and I know we'll talk about the supply and demand piece a little bit later, which I think is critically important. But, I think when you look at what different countries have done, the biggest takeaway message, and I think it still applies today for sure, is you really do have to be quite agile if you're going to engage in industrial strategy to promote clean energy technology, and you care about where you fall on that supply chain. Like you really do have to be quite in touch with where your economy and your industry can be competitive. You have to have a lot tighter collaboration between the industry and the government in the sense of like keeping on top of these things, right? So I do worry that we can sometimes appear a little bit flat-footed, right? Which is, we could just create sort of a domestic manufacturing industry for solar PV. It's like, well, actually, let's look across all of these emerging clean energy technologies and the established ones and figure out where we actually have comparative advantages. And I think a supply chain review sort of counterintuitively is a really good place to start with that, because there are 2 reasons you subsidize or you invest in these technologies in addition to trying to sort of decarbonize your economy. But one is to sort of understand where you can be competitive. And the second is to understand where you have some other strategic value in having those resources. And I think this is a place where we've not talked about it a lot here. We do have a subsequent report coming out about it, is in critical minerals, right? So like people tend to think about critical minerals as, oh, we need access to a basic resource. That's not necessarily true. Access to a basic resource, but a long-term plan for thinking about how strategic and critical minerals will be embedded in the supply chain, and which parts of that, supply chain do you need to be involved in to cover all your vulnerabilities versus which ones just make sense for you to have a more diversified supply chain approach. This is the kind of strategic review that you have to do, but it's not like there's going to be like sort of one set answer, right? It's going to be about staying on top of how these very dynamic sectors are changing. And one of the things that was really clear, and I think, Ethan, you mentioned it in the solar PV cases in particular, is how dynamic it was over the period of time that countries were trying to sort of protect their domestic market, and their inability to sort of stay on top of that, alongside these trade disputes really, caused some damage. And I think that that's really important for us to consider as we think about this going forward, because there is a high likelihood in these strategically, important areas that there could be additional trade disputes that essentially just raise costs or stymie your effort to be able to, create sort of a domestic industry. And that would be a negative outcome for everybody, right? That's not good for your domestic economic policy. That's not good for the global sort of, decarbonization effort. So I think it's really important to take those lessons that we've experienced from the past and apply them to the kinds of things that we're hearing talked about, going forward. For example, I think we're putting a lot on decarbonization policy at the very same time that we're asking it to move at lightning speed, right? So the other lesson from these stories is, we've as much as we may or may not want to admit this, we haven't been moving as fast as we're supposed to in terms of decarbonization efforts over the last couple of decades. What we're proposing to do in these net zero by 2050 plans is to move quite a bit faster. And so that means that the experience we've had, it kind of looked like sort of a slow a version of what we're going to see going forward. And I think that that's important to sort of, put everybody in the right posture for understanding, what the pace and the potential competitive pressures could look like. I think the other thing, and it didn't quite came out in the case studies, but I think it's really important when you look at particularly how supply chains sort of, worked their way around these trade disputes, right? When they sort of evolved to sort of deal with the fact that there were trade disputes between country A and country B. And then other countries were starting to try and say, like in Southeast Asia in particular, like, how do I insert myself into this supply chain? Like, what role do I play? I think it's really important for us to be thinking about this not just as a US exercise or a Chinese exercise, but really, thinking about the way in which we need to rely on allies and partners around the world. China in particular, right? This would be a very bad news story if people did less, clean energy promotion as a result of the way this goes, as opposed to more. And so those conversations with allies about, okay, how do we really build, a resilient clean energy space, both for the existing technologies we have? I think the big ticket opportunities are on some of these innovative new areas, like in the hydrogen economy. What do the supply chains look like for that? Those types of areas, there's just going to be a lot of, places for people to go and to try and engage in thinking about those. So I oftentimes feel like when we look at these case studies, we look at how they pit countries against each other. But I think the lesson here is, there is still a lot of room for coordination and collaboration, sort of both among the private sector and the public sector, to think about how we make these durable supply chains going forward.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you also for sort of preemptively answering about 4 of the questions that I see have come in. There was one question about what are things that you would emulate from China, and I think you gave a good answer to that. People are asking about strategic minerals, and so I also appreciate the plug for some forthcoming work that you'll see out of CSIS. One of the things that really I took away from your answer, but also from the work that we did, there's kind of like an element of iteration that you just kind of have to keep at it. But you can't just keep at it randomly. There's kind of like purpose and iteration, right? That if you just kind of every year or 2 years, you just slap on another tariff kind of randomly, it's really hard for the private sector to sort of figure out what to do with that. Even though, as you pointed out, sort of trade finds a way to get around some of these barriers. But the one thing that you said at the end that I just wanted to make sure that to flag, because I think that's really important. We have just like a ton of new technologies that we're going to be deploying in the next 20 years. And so it's not just about how do I try to win the last war, but how do you think about the new technologies and how do you position yourself in those new technologies? And with that, Ethan, let me turn to you. The interplay between sort of supply policies and demand policies, you've articulated that in the context of our 3 case studies, but I know you also have thought a lot about this in the context of the United States. And so I was wondering if you could offer some sort of reflections on what we have learned about the need to pair these policies or not. To what extent should we think about a deployment strategy alongside a manufacturing strategy, and whether those 2 things should be coordinated or not? I know you've thought a lot about this topic, so let me turn to you for that.
Thanks. So I mean, I guess to vastly oversimplify, I would say that at least it's my opinion that that if you try to forge an industrial policy and growth and you only focus on one side or the other, you're not likely to succeed. You need to think about both supply and demand, and that's sort of rooted, at least in what I've seen over the last 15 years, which is on the demand side. If you give people free money to put solar on their roof or to buy an electric vehicle, guess what? They will do so. And then when you stop giving them the free money, they will probably stop doing so, at least in the past when these technologies weren't cost competitive. That's changed and they now are. But we saw this story in Germany where a market grew and then shrank. And we saw this places like the Czech Republic and Italy. The state of Georgia offered a very generous rebate for electric vehicles on top of the federal rebate. And for a while, Georgia was a hot EV market, and then suddenly it wasn't when it was gone. So, you can make bubbles by making it easier for consumers to get clean energy goods, and that's great. But you will not necessarily make industries. because you need to basically assure the market that there will be a long-term demand for that product before you will often get equipment makers wanting to make major multi-billion-dollar investments. And on that side of things, there's been probably less cases where countries have sought to just subsidize supply, but there have been some, and they haven't always been terribly successful, or they lead to cases where you either build a plant that doesn't end up being used because there isn't enough demand, or it becomes outmoded. Or in some cases, you're sort of pushing on a string. You provide a lot of government support, but the manufacturer just doesn't want to use that tax credit, say, to build that plant because they don't have a long-term belief. So you really need to think about both sides of the equation. And one last thing I would argue is that you need to be in a market that has some degree of scale to begin with. So it's all wonderful that the Czech Republic might want to have both supply and demand, but if it's not that big a market, then there's only so big a plant someone's going to build in the country to serve it. We are the United States of America. We certainly have enough scale so that if we wanted to do both sides of this, that you could have a thriving industry, but you will need to provide assurances to private sector players that the demand will be there longer term. And not little bubbles of support in terms of teeing up demand. So you really need to address both sides, and that's obviously a very high level, non-specific piece of advice, but I think it's one that I hope that people think about going forward. As I know there's a lot of policy making underway, thinking about both sides of this.
Thank you for that, Ethan. And if the audience will allow me, there's been a few questions that have been about sort of other technologies that we haven't really gotten into, nuclear, hydrogen. And so if you'll allow me, I will suggest that some of what Ethan just said, I think is a good framework for thinking about how do these lessons apply to other technologies. I don't want to get us sort of switched over to nuclear and hydrogen because each of those is its own beast. But I would posit that some of the lessons apply there. Let's talk a little bit about human rights, Xinjiang and China. This has come up in a number of times in the questions. It's come up obviously with the news reports that we've been getting out of China. I wanted to turn to you, Ethan, first for a comment on, you guys have some of the best information in the world about what's happening where. So maybe help us understand how big of a deal this is. What are we talking about production-wise, output capacity-wise? Help us sort of frame this conversation with some data. And then maybe to you, Sarah, sort of trying to think about, one of the final comments you made on your earlier questions is there is no way we will not deal with geopolitical and human rights and governance and all these challenges when it comes to clean energy. And this seems like a perfect example of what you're talking about there. So maybe come to you for thoughts on what this means at the strategic level. But Ethan, give us some information, help us understand what we're talking about here.
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing to note is that, a substantial portion of the world's polysilicon manufacturing capacity is based in that province, a bit over a third of the worldwide capacity, and a number of the most modern and efficient plants. So it is a place where there's a lot of output. Our projection for 2021 is that, if there is, no major policy action, you might see as much as half of the world's solar grade polysilicon come out of that region because those plants operate at high capacity factors, and like I said, they're quite modern. So this is a relevant issue. There has certainly been some companies that have declared that they would like more transparency, and some manufacturers who said that they're going to provide it as well. I think it's something we'll have to wait and see. I will say this, which is that if and I don't want to speculate too much on this, but if there were sanctions or if there were something that would boost the cost of equipment that came out of that province, there is enough manufacturing of polysilicon around the world that it wouldn't end the market by any means, but it could boost prices just a little bit. And it could also, it might in some cases, make solar modules that don't use silicon, give them a bit of an advantage, so namely thin film modules made by companies like First Solar. So it's certainly something that that I would say we're going to sort of keep an eye on and see how it develops.
Thank you. If I could just add, so the data geek in me feels like one of the things that we have to get better at is just the transparency of information about these markets, capacity, trade flows. I mean, we think about oil and gas, and you can pinpoint to the field level what is produced where. You have maps of pipelines, port facilities, ships, and so we have developed this tremendous amount of information infrastructure, and a lot of that is still being developed by companies like BloombergNEF, but it makes it harder to have good public discourse if you don't have access to that information understanding. So really appreciate when people that have and are collecting this information can share that, because that makes it for a much better dialogue. Sarah, did you want to say something about Xinjiang?
Yeah, just quickly so we can get to some other questions too. I mean, I think that it's the, it's the intersection of two things, right? One is we realize that the people part of energy is really important, right? This is we've always sort of recognized it, but we do have a tendency to ignore it. And I think the sort of environmental justice movement, full scale, the Just Transitions Initiative shows that like the people, the human rights aspects, the impact of energy on people's lives and livelihoods is just going to be strategically at a different level for all firms, for governments, for local communities, the whole shebang. And it's going to take us a long time to like figure out, how we're going to react and respond. And then on a more conventional level, as you mentioned, Nikos, this is what the problem is with not understanding our vulnerability in a supply chain, right? So for example, if we decided we wanted to take some sort of acute action because we didn't like the human rights treatment, in anything, whether it's this or critical minerals or whatever, we all of a sudden realize, oh, wait a minute, we're not prepared to do that. Right. It's very similar to like where we found ourselves in the early days of oil supply security. We just haven't prepared in that way. And so I do think that it's a really good example of like the types of surprises that we don't want, because it sort of sets us back on a whole range of different kinds of goals.
Thank you for that. Let me, looking mindful of the clock, I think we're about 2.5, 3 minutes. There have been just like a ton of questions on minerals, critical minerals, rare earths, what can you diversify? What can you reduce your reliance on China on? What can you produce at home, manufacture? So I'm blending about like 7 questions together. So I apologize for that. But yeah, Ethan, I just wanted to sort of get a sense from you of like, how do you think about this topic? I mean, is this something that, just kind of going to go away over time because we're going to develop new supply sources? Are we tied to geology? Is something we should not be as worried about? Is it something that we should be as worried about, but maybe only for some commodities, not others? How are you guys thinking about this topic?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'll do my best shot in 30 seconds here, but it's and by the way, there's rare earths, and then there's also critical things like lithium and cobalt and stuff like that. And it's not just where you get it out of the ground; it's where you refine it. And China has a very strong presence in refining of cobalt and lithium, for that matter. Long story short is, these rare earths are used are really critical in electric motors, and they're important also in direct drive wind turbines, which are increasingly used for offshore wind turbines, which is potentially the biggest, one of the bigger parts of the U.S. growth picture for renewables over the next 10 years. So it matters. The only, not getting into too much, I think that the world has some pretty high degree of confidence that demand for rare earths will grow over the next 10 years. I mean, we're projecting it's at least a 50 to 100% growth over the next 10 years. That kind of optimism can trigger the people to actually build the facilities and the mines and the work that needs to be done to get them out, because you can do this other places, but you need to invest a lot of money to get rare earths, and so maybe this will trigger that.
Thank you for that comment, Ethan, and maybe that's a great cue for me to plug once again the deep dives that are on our website from BloombergNEF. I mean, if you really want to take this big topic of critical or strategic minerals and really break it down and understand what kind of products we're talking about, where are they being produced, where do they go for refining, how do they then end up through 3, 4, or 5 more stages before they become a final product. That information is in there, and I think it's critically important that we talk about these issues with the specificity that they require. Listen, we are at time and we want to end on time. And so I wanted to say thank you to you, Sarah, thank you to you, Ethan, and both for your presence here, but also, of course, for your partnership and the intellectual weight that you have put behind this project. As we said, this is not a one-off. This is something that the team at the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program will be spending a lot of time on this year, in response, of course, to also where the administration is, where this country is. So stay tuned. There'll be more stuff coming out. And in the meantime, thank you to our speakers, and go read the reports. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.